Hello, so today's video is great perfumes that perhaps didn't do as well as might be expected by a brand. Perfumes that essentially flopped in some way or another. And that's not to say they didn't make money, but they didn't make as much money as might have been expected, and they didn't linger on the market as long as perhaps a brand envisaged. So perfume is a really crowded market. There are over 6,000 releases a year now. And really even back in the less crowded market of the 2010s, there were several fragrances that are now well regarded, but at the time just didn't make it. So we're going to look back and just consider the reasons why those fragrances didn't make the cut. So if you've not seen me before, I'm Claire. I talk all about fragrance on this channel, and I love talking about perfume history, perfume science, perfume psychology, and I also love reviewing fragrances, and I love doing perfume tags as well. So if that kind of thing interests you and you haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing, and please also press the like button if you do enjoy this kind of content. So some of the reasons why these fragrances flopped are pretty predictable, and others are more to do with the brand's strategy or the brand's advertising of the fragrance. And I think it's really interesting to look back at what's worked and what hasn't. And it's a real warning to brands to think very carefully about the other fragrances they're marketing at the same time to maximise their potential to make money. And I think this is especially true in the designer market when there is limited shelf space in shops, and that exposure to the market is so important. And I also think it's really interesting that all of these fragrances were really appreciated by critics and are now quite sought after by collectors. They've become classics, perhaps because of their rarity, but also because of their artistic qualities. And I think that's really something that isn't perhaps appreciated all the time in the designer market. So let's look at the fragrances that just didn't make it. So the first fragrance I want to mention is one that I actually own, and this one I think is considered now a real classic, but it never really seemed to take off when it was on the market. So this one is Florabotanica, and it's by Balenciaga. So Balenciaga as a brand have done a very strange thing with their fragrances. They exited the fragrance market, I think around 2020, 2021, and now they've re-entered the market, but in a very different style, and they've gone back to some of their very earliest vintage releases. So Balenciaga as a brand are always a little bit offbeat. If you look at their clothing lines, they're always very futuristic feeling, very architectural and bold and unexpected. And I would say that that really rings true with their fragrances too, or it did with this one. And I think that was perhaps a deliberate direction by the brand director at the time. Florabotanica is a fragrance that won industry awards when it was first released. So in 2013 it won the Best Prestige Fragrance Award, yet it was never a super popular fragrance with the general public. So why was that? So I think a big part of this fragrance perhaps not doing as well as it might have done at the time was because it just didn't hit the right scent profile for the time period. So if you think back to the early 2010s, fragrances either presented rose as very sweet and very jammy, or very soft and romantic. And this is neither of those things. If you think about Trésor Midnight Rose, or if you think about Chloe Eau de Parfum, this is a very different type of rose to those fragrances. Here, rose is presented as an almost just cut stem. It's very fresh, very dewy, very green, almost a little bit sharp, slightly metallic feeling even. It's a very different take on rose. Another reason was the very prominent use of herbal notes in this fragrance. So I think that is something that's very unexpected in women's fragrances at that time. And the use of notes such as mint in particular can really make people think of things that they don't associate with fragrances, and can make the fragrance feel medicinal to some people. The mint in this fragrance also gives an immediate cooling sensation, and whilst that cool, crisp feel is distinctive, it was bucking the trend at the time, which was more towards warmer feeling fragrances. Another trend that this fragrance completely ignored was the gourmand trend. And this fragrance really lacks sweetness in the most part. There is a bit of sweetness to the rose slightly. It does make me think of Turkish Delight at points in this fragrance, but I wouldn't ever describe this fragrance as sweet overall. At the time, many bestsellers contained notes such as vanilla, very sweet sugary patchoulis, caramel, sugary fruits or praline, and this fragrance just completely sidesteps that trend and stays aromatic and fresh. Florabotanica also really blurs the lines with genders, and it's something that doesn't feel overtly feminine, to me at least. And I think this fragrance definitely could have been marketed as unisex. I think this fragrance maybe suffered because at the time, this kind of fragrance being marketed to women was relatively unusual. Ironically, many of the qualities that people love about this fragrance limited its mass market appeal, so it's not an easygoing crowd pleaser, and it just arrived at the wrong time. It was slap bang in the middle of the gourmand boom of the 2010s. Florabotanica now is sought after and seen as a fragrance that was ahead of its time. Perfume tastes have really shifted over the last decade, and I think that's why this one has become a bit of a classic. People started to search for it as soon as it was discontinued. People missed it. People were talking about it more because it had been reduced in price, and I think that really created a lot of buzz and hype about this fragrance. And that's really when I bought my bottle as soon as it was discontinued, because I just had tried it in store. I thought it was slightly weird, but I thought it was interesting. And I was just getting into fragrance at the time, and there was something about this that made me want to own it. I just think this fragrance is very ahead of its time. It's very distinctive. And it really anticipated the move towards fresher, more realistic floral fragrances and the shift away from gourmand, overly sugary, frutuli kind of fragrances. So that's Florabotanica by Balenciaga. So this next one might feel like a really odd fragrance to say there was a flop, because it did sell. All of these sold in some way or another, but it just wasn't the long-term commercial success that its brand was looking for, and that its brand had already experienced with other fragrances in its line. So this one is from Marc Jacobs, and it's Decadence. So Decadence was supposed to be the new hit fragrance from Marc Jacobs back in 2015. And this launched with a huge advertising campaign. It had this very elaborate bottle with this very striking handbag design. And it was something that just felt very different for Marc Jacobs. If you think about Marc Jacobs' other fragrances on the market at the time, really its blockbuster fragrance, which still is its blockbuster fragrance, is Daisy. Daisy was very safe, it was very girly, it was very easygoing. Decadence just wasn't that. And again, this fragrance was lauded by the industry. It won a fragrance award for Best Luxury Fragrance back in 2016, a year after its release. So what are the reasons why Daisy is still on the market, yet Decadence is long gone? So this one is a bit of wrong fragrance, wrong time again. So it was, again, the opposite direction to which the rest of the market was moving in. In 2015, the market was moving towards cleaner fragrances, airy florals, fruity florals, cleaner musks, fresher feeling white flowers, and lighter gourmands. Bestsellers at the time included things like Chanel Eau Tendre, Dior Miss Dior, YSL's Black Opium, and Le Vie Belle by Lancôme. And I think there are some sweeter, darker fragrances there. If you think about Black Opium, it is sweet, it is darker, it is heavier, but it is something that has a very likeable coffee vanilla profile, which Decadence just does not have. Decadence is richer, it's woodier, it's heavier, it's got a really strong ambery note, and there's also just this booziness from the plum. There is vanilla here, it's not listed, but it is very green in its feel. And it's very distinctively different, this fragrance. It just didn't fit in with the rest of the market at the time. It felt much closer to the heavier ambery fragrances of the 80s and 90s, rather than the lighter feeling fragrances that were appearing in the mid-2010s. Its next problem was that designer fragrances are usually immediately likeable. Decadence was something that rewarded repeated tries. It's something that takes a bit of getting used to, I would say, Decadence. I think it can be love at first sniff, but I think that's going to be a very select group of people who do love this one at first sniff, especially when it comes to the general public, not just the fragrance enthusiasts that hang around on YouTube. And also, many consumers found this one too dark, too unusual, and they also had concerns that it wasn't a fragrance for daily wear. It felt more like a going out kind of fragrance. Basically, again, what made Decadence distinctive and appreciated by fragrance enthusiasts meant that it probably wasn't going to be popular with the general public. Its other problem was the bottle. It's distinctive, it makes it stand out, but it's divisive. The bottle and presentation was also complicated. It came in a velvet coated box. It also had a tassel, had a very elaborate gold chain, it had a snakeskin covered lid, lots of metal components, lots of things to manufacture, and also a very heavy glass bottle in a very distinctive colour. The bottle itself is also an odd shape. It's something that doesn't fit nicely into collections. And it's also awkward to hold and difficult to travel with. Whilst it was visually iconic, its design sacrificed everyday usability. The other problem with this one was that Marc Jacobs already had a very defined brand identity, and that was based on the Daisy line. So Daisy represented something youthful, carefree, floral, bright and cheerful. Decadence was not those things. Decadence, on the other hand, was seductive, glamorous, luxurious and mysterious, and it felt like an evening time fragrance. This dramatic shift in direction made this fragrance a hard sell to core Marc Jacobs fragrance customers, and therefore the brand had to attract a whole new audience to buy this fragrance. People who would never ever have considered buying Daisy had to be persuaded to go and try this new release from Marc Jacobs to enable the brand to attract a new audience. And that is a hard thing for a brand to do. Because of this, Daisy continued to dominate sales, and that meant that retailers, when they were trying to work out with shelf space which fragrance they were going to allocate that space to, they would always choose Daisy over Decadence because Daisy sold better. This would have eventually led to reduced visibility for this fragrance and would have contributed to a drop in its sales. The problem too with this line was that it produced a few flankers, but neither of them really took off. Neither of them were that popular, and they also diluted the idea of the original fragrance. The flankers were much lighter and much easier going, and that distracted consumers from what this fragrance was and just confused them. Ironically, this fragrance initially sold very well due to the eye-catching advertising campaign, but it didn't sustain sales, and that dip in sales caused this to be discontinued around 2020. It disappeared quickly from view and quickly became much sought after. Critics absolutely loved this fragrance. They often praised its composition, its quality, and said that it was distinctively different from other designer launches at the time. Decadence was really regarded as one of the boldest releases on the designer market of the entire decade. It was really very appreciated by critics and clearly also by a small fan base, but it just didn't ever hit the dizzy heights of a fragrance like Daisy. Decadence illustrates a key lesson. Being distinctive is not enough. The fragrance really succeeded artistically, but it just didn't fit with the public's image of the Marc Jacobs brand, and that ultimately is why this one disappeared from the market. The next fragrance I'm going to talk about is one from Gucci, and I think this one again is very well regarded today. It's something that people look for and something that people on YouTube tell me to look back on fondly. But I just remember this disappearing really very quickly from when it was first marketed. So this one is Gucci Mémoire d'une Odeur, which was released in 2019. So this was artistically very successful as a fragrance, but in a commercial sense, extremely unsuccessful. Memoir failed because it just ignored the conventions of designer perfumery, and that meant that it struggled to find its place on the market. So if you think back to 2019, the fragrances that Gucci were marketing were fragrances like Gucci Bloom, Gucci Flora, Gucci Guilty. Consumers associated Gucci with lush florals, sensual ambers, and glamorous femininity. With this fragrance, Alberto Marias produced something that smelt ozonic, herbal, powdery, like dry herbs and soft woods. Something compared with chamomile tea, something that had a very soft, musky profile. It felt almost anti-luxury in character. Chamomile in particular was a huge commercial risk. It's just a fragrance note you don't see in designer perfumery because it makes things smell herbal. It can be green, it can be yellow feeling, and it can just make things smell like hay. And some people associate it with shampoos or herbal remedies for coughs. This fragrance can be even reminiscent of old books and dry grass, and for those reasons, for those distinctive characteristics, that's why this one is celebrated today, because fragrance enthusiasts love those different distinctive details. This fragrance feels almost like a niche fragrance nowadays compared with what you might expect from a designer release. It's just not something that would be released nowadays on the designer market because it doesn't fit. This fragrance was also marketed very unusually as a gender neutral fragrance, and it's something that Gucci haven't done since. The advertising campaign featured Harry Styles in what was meant to be a very gender fluid feeling overall story that was directed by Alessandro Michel, the creative director of Gucci at the time. The problem is that the designer market tends to prefer gendered fragrances. People like to be told, wear this, don't wear this. And having a gender neutral fragrance was confusing to the market. Who is this for? Who should pick this up? What does the bottle say? Is this a feminine fragrance? Is this a masculine fragrance? People just like to be pointed in the right direction. Whether that is something that is correct in perfumery or not is going to depend on your viewpoint. But for a lot of people who are really enthusiastic about fragrance, fragrances are genderless. But for the general public, generally fragrances have a gender. And a unisex marketed fragrance can be a really hard sell in the world of designer perfumery. The scent profile of this fragrance also made it feel very understated and contemplative and sensitive almost, and that is something that does not sell fragrances. It feels very much more like a niche fragrance than a designer fragrance because this doesn't have the immediate appeal upon first spray. The opening is arguably the most difficult part of this fragrance, and I think it's something that is not necessarily that friendly. It's got quite a bitterness to it with the almond here, and also with the herbal feel of the chamomile, and also with the ozonic feel in the opening. It's just not something that has you at hello, or it doesn't have most people at hello. And I think that also contributed to the struggle that this fragrance might have had with getting a grip on the market. This fragrance was also criticised for its poor performance. People said it had poor longevity. I personally don't find that, but it is a quieter fragrance, and I think that might be why people think of this as having poor performance. It's just a very subtle fragrance overall, and I think the name as well didn't help this fragrance. If you think about how this fragrance sounds, if you just say it and you're an English speaker, Mémoire d'une odeur sounds like odour, and odour is not a positive word in English. It's meant to be quite neutral, but actually odour suggests something bad. If you talk about an odour, you're generally talking about something that doesn't smell good, and that was also a problem with this fragrance. The concept of the fragrance was meant to be about the idea of memory, but that's a hard sell again to a designer perfume market. People really just want a note profile to cling on to, or an easier concept. Is this seductive? Is this mysterious? Is this dark? Is this happy? You know, a memory is something that's a little bit more of an artistic concept in fragrance, and I don't think that fits with the designer perfume market. Again, since this fragrance has been discontinued, it's become somewhat of a cult classic, and I did search this one out only this year. I think Gucci Mémoire is just such a calming, nostalgic feeling fragrance, and it's been described as one of the most distinctive fragrance releases of the last 10 years, and I would agree with that. I think on the designer market this really stands out. It's something very different, but it just didn't fit in at the time, and I think actually if this had been tweaked slightly and released as a niche fragrance, it might have done well, but it just wasn't appropriate for a designer fragrance. And the gender neutral marketing did it absolutely no favours, even though I do appreciate that Gucci took that risk and I love them for doing that, but it just was ahead of its time. It was just too early and the concept was just not quite there. So that's Gucci Mémoire d'une odeur. So with all of these fragrances that are featured, they weren't bad fragrances. They were really critically acclaimed fragrances, but they just didn't fit at the time. Some had challenging note profiles, some just didn't fit with the brand's aesthetic or the brand's marketing of the fragrance. Some of them were even just crowded out by the other fragrances that the brand marketed. Essentially, successful designer fragrances need to appeal to a wide audience, and that's going to be millions of consumers across the world. A few of these fragrances might have been better suited to the niche market where originality and subtlety is celebrated. In the mainstream designer sector though, standing out can be dangerous. It can definitely be a commercial disadvantage, but you do need to be distinctively different enough to be memorable. And that is a balance that all of these fragrances seem to get wrong. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have enjoyed it, then please do press the like button, and please also consider subscribing if you haven't done already. And please do let me know if there's a particular fragrance that you especially love that you think just wasn't commercially successful and was discontinued before its time. Is there one that you really miss that you think just deserved to do a little bit better, or was before its time, or just out of time? I would love to hear some more examples. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.